I got to the Airbnb I had rented at around 2 a.m. on New Year's Eve. The road was nearly empty, and the chill of the night wrapped around me. The property looked charming, with soft lights highlighting its rustic architecture, but the isolation was already making me feel a little uneasy. I dropped my bags in the hallway and walked into the living room, where a fireplace was crackling, giving the place a warm and cozy vibe. It seemed like the perfect setting for a quiet night away from the city's chaos. As I explored the house, I noticed a locked door at the end of the hallway. I figured it was just a storage closet or maybe an extra bathroom and didn't think much of it. I settled into the living room with a glass of wine, trying to relax and get used to the place. But later, as I was getting ready for bed, I started hearing soft tapping sounds coming from the direction of the locked door. At first, I thought it was just the wind hitting the windows or the house creaking, so I brushed it off, chalking it up to my imagination and exhaustion. I decided the best thing to do was to try and sleep, even though the tapping continued. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating a setting that was both comforting and slightly unsettling. I wrapped myself in a blanket and closed my eyes, trying to block out the sounds that seemed to grow louder as the night went on. With each tap, my heart beat a little faster, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a louder, more rhythmic noise coming from the locked door. My body froze as I lay there, listening intently. The tapping now felt deliberate, almost like someone, or something, was trying to send a message. My first instinct was to get up and check it out, but anxiety rooted me in place. I took a deep breath, trying to rationalize that it could just be the house settling or reacting to the cold. But an unsettling feeling kept creeping in, making it impossible to fully dismiss the sounds. As the sun began to rise, soft morning light streamed into the house, washing away some of the night's eerie shadows. I felt relieved that I had made it through the night, but a lingering unease remained. I decided to step outside for some fresh air, hoping a walk around the yard would clear my head and let me enjoy the start of the new year in peace. The crisp morning air carried the scent of damp earth, and a light mist clung to the trees, giving the surroundings a nearly magical quality. Back inside, curiosity got the better of me, and I went back to the locked door. As I approached it, something caught my eye. Deep scratches marked the wood, as if someone, or something, had tried to force it open during the night. My heart started racing and a wave of fear washed over me. I couldn't imagine what might be behind that door, and the thought of not being alone in this secluded house filled me with dread. I knew I had to figure out what was going on, but the mix of doubt and fear held me back. Determined to get some answers, I grabbed my phone and started searching for information about the house and its history. At first, my search turned up nothing unusual, just the standard story of an old house renovated and put up for rent. But I kept digging and eventually stumbled across a local forum where former residents shared their experiences. My heart sank as I read a post about unexplained noises and strange sightings in the same area on New Year's Eve, years ago. The description matched my experience too closely for comfort. The unease consumed me, though logic kept trying to convince me there was a rational explanation for everything. I decided not to let fear ruin my vacation and tried to stick to my planned activities. Yet I couldn't stop thinking about the scratches on the door or the sounds I'd heard during the night. As I packed my things to head out and enjoy the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide something, and the silence of the house grew increasingly suffocating. New Year's Eve, a time meant for celebration and renewal, was turning into a harrowing experience I didn't know how to face. I decided I had to confront my fears and figure out what was happening in that house. Summoning my courage, I approached the locked door again, examining the scratches closely. They seemed fresher than I'd initially thought. My mind raced, trying to figure out what could have caused them. A trespasser, an animal, or something more sinister. I decided to try pushing the door, hoping it was just stuck. To my surprise, it opened with a faint creak, revealing a dark hallway beyond. With my heart pounding, I stepped into the corridor, using my phone as a makeshift flashlight. The air was cold and heavy, and the silence was absolute except for the faint sound of my own breathing. As I moved further in, it became clear the space seemed endless, as if the house held countless secrets. Suddenly, a fleeting shadow crossed my line of vision, making me stop in my tracks. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity urged me forward, even as chills ran down my spine. I kept walking down the dim hallway, each step echoing off the silent walls. The feeling of being watched never left me, and the shadow I had seen earlier seemed to be guiding me, or perhaps daring me, to press on. My heart was racing and my hands trembled slightly as I gripped my phone more tightly. Suddenly, the hallway opened into a small empty room with just a dusty window letting in weak morning light. There was no sign of anyone, only the oppressive silence and the overwhelming sense that something, or someone, was still nearby. I decided to explore the room, hoping to find a logical explanation for the previous night's events. The old furniture was coated in dust, and a cracked mirror reflected a distorted version of me. As I examined the space, I noticed an old rocking chair in the corner, swaying gently even though there wasn't a hint of a breeze. A chill ran down my spine, and I started to question my sanity. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, coming from behind the chair. Slowly, I turned around, but there was no one there. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I knew I had to get out of there immediately. I decided I couldn't stay in that room any longer and bolted back down the dark hallway, feeling every beat of my heart like a warning drum. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift as I moved, making the space feel even more oppressive. When I finally reached the main door at the end of the hallway, I paused for a moment, trying to steady my breath. The urgency to leave that place overwhelmed me, but part of me still yearned to understand what was going on. I stood by the door, caught in a battle between fear and curiosity. My rational mind told me to leave the house, abandon the mystery, and prioritize my safety. But something deeper, something unexplainable, held me there. Taking another deep breath, I decided to make one last effort to uncover what was happening. I turned back toward the hallway, hesitating for a moment before stepping forward. This time, the silence of the house felt heavier, almost as if it was alive and pressing against me. The shadows seemed to move more deliberately, and the air carried a faint metallic smell I hadn't noticed before. Each step I took felt harder, as though the house itself was resisting my movements. I reached the small room again and stood in the doorway, unsure of what I was even looking for. The rocking chair was still swaying faintly in the corner, and I felt drawn toward it, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay away. As I approached, the faint whispering sound returned, clearer this time but still impossible to understand. It wasn't just a single voice. It sounded like several, overlapping and echoing off the walls. I stopped just short of the chair, frozen in fear and unable to decide whether to turn back or keep going. Suddenly, the chair stopped moving. The silence that followed was deafening, and the air seemed to grow even colder. My phone's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Before I could react, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there, just the endless hallway stretching back toward the rest of the house. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, as if the house itself was choking off my voice. Trembling, I backed away from the chair and stumbled into the middle of the room. That's when I saw it. Faint markings on the floor, almost like symbols carved into the wood. They formed a pattern I didn't recognize, but something about them felt deeply wrong, as if they didn't belong in this world. I snapped a picture with my phone, hoping to make sense of it later, and turned to leave the room for good. But as I reached the doorway, the faint sound of whispering rose again, louder this time and tinged with urgency. It felt like the house was trying to keep me there, to stop me from leaving. My breathing grew shallow, and I bolted, running as fast as I could back down the hallway. The house seemed to shift around me as I ran, the walls narrowing and the shadows growing darker. I reached the living room, gasping for air, and grabbed my keys from the table. Without a second thought, I threw open the front door and stepped into the freezing morning air. The cold was sharp against my skin, but it was a relief compared to the oppressive atmosphere inside the house. With quick steps, I rushed back to the main room of the house where the morning light was starting to seep in. I thought the fear would begin to fade, but something still felt off. I decided to check if there was anything else hidden in the house, something that might explain the sounds and movements I had witnessed. As I moved from room to room, the feeling of being watched never left me, and every small noise made me jump. Then, as I passed through the kitchen, I noticed an old staircase leading down to the basement, a space I hadn't realized was there before. Despite my fear, I decided I needed to see what was in the basement. The wooden stairs creaked under each step, and the darkness below seemed to swallow the light from my phone. I descended slowly, trying to stay calm, but each crack of the old boards beneath my feet only heightened my anxiety. At the bottom of the stairs, a dim light hung from a single bulb on the ceiling, casting weak illumination over the cramped and poorly lit space. The air was thick and damp, carrying the musty smell of mold that made me cough softly. I cautiously explored the basement, scanning shelves packed with old objects and dusty boxes. In the far corner, I noticed a worn wooden table with a few crumpled papers and a chair that had been knocked over, as if someone had left in a hurry. That's when I saw it, a dark figure standing motionless in the opposite corner of the room. My heart raced, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I tried to move, but my legs felt too shaky to respond. The figure began to move slowly toward me, and I realized this wasn't just my imagination. Whatever it was, it wanted me to know a truth it had kept hidden. Time seemed to slow as the figure approached. Each step echoed in the oppressive silence of the basement, amplifying the tension building inside me. I tried to force my legs to move, but I was paralyzed by fear. When the shadow was only a few feet away, something unexpected happened. It stopped abruptly. Without saying a word, it turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone once again. My heart still pounding, I took a deep breath, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I knew it was time to leave, immediately. I ran back up the stairs, barely touching the creaking wooden planks, and reached the main room. I slammed the basement door shut behind me and locked it, letting out a sigh of relief. But the sensation of being watched hadn't disappeared. Frantically, I grabbed my bags and started preparing to leave the house as fast as I could. As I gathered my belongings, I glanced one last time at the locked door, a shiver running down my spine. Without looking back, I left the property, vowing never to return and never knowing what truly happened that New Year's Eve.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
On New Year's Eve, I decided to stay late at school to finish grading the stack of tests that had been piling up. Working alone at that hour always felt a little weird, but with the holidays approaching and important deadlines looming, I figured it was my best option. The school was silent, except for the occasional ticking of the clock marking the hours. The fluorescent lights flickered now and then, adding an unsettling vibe. But I tried to stay focused on the papers scattered across my desk. While I was reviewing the students' answers, I noticed a flickering light coming from the library. It caught my attention because the library was supposed to be completely empty at that time. I got up from my chair, trying not to overthink it, and headed toward the source of the flickering. The hallway was dark, lit only by the intermittent glow coming through the library windows. When I walked in, everything was silent, except for the faint sound of the clock ticking in the teacher's lounge. I looked around but didn't see anyone. However, I noticed one of the chairs at the reading table was still warm, as if someone had just been sitting there. On my way back to the grading room, the silence in the school felt even heavier. Every step I took echoed through the empty hallways, making my heart race. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound, like children giggling, coming from somewhere nearby. I froze, straining to figure out where it was coming from, but there was no one in sight. My chest tightened, and an uneasy feeling washed over me. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the faint, playful voice that seemed to mess with my head. As I made my way toward the exit, the corridor lights started flickering erratically, as if struggling to stay on. I glanced back, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but once again, there was nothing. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing second, and I started doubting my own sanity. The giggling grew louder for just a moment before vanishing as mysteriously as it had appeared. Finally, I reached the main doors and pushed them open, relieved to feel the cool New Year's Eve air wrap around me. Still catching my breath in the cold night air, I stopped for a moment to collect myself. People were starting to gather in the streets, getting ready to celebrate the countdown to midnight, but I felt completely disconnected from all of it. I decided it was time to finally head home. But as I turned to leave, I noticed one of the lights near the main entrance flickering strangely, casting distorted shadows on the ground. With my heart still racing, I started walking toward the parking lot, trying to shake off the unsettling thoughts that clung to me. Every step felt heavier, like something invisible was holding me back. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept past me, causing the streetlights to flicker. I glanced back at the school and saw a vague figure standing at the entrance, but when I tried to focus on it, the figure vanished, leaving only the distant echo of those eerie, childlike giggles still ringing in my mind. As I kept walking toward the parking lot, the sense that something was terribly off refused to fade. The lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. My heart pounded in my chest, and every step felt heavier than the last. I tried to focus on the crowd gathering for the countdown, but the image of that vague figure lingered in my mind, haunting me. The faint sound of children giggling still echoed in the air, now intertwined with an eerie silence that seemed to press down on everything. I finally reached the parking lot, where only a handful of people were present, some chatting cheerfully as they waited for the new year. I decided it was time to leave, but as I turned toward my car, I noticed one of the doors was slightly open. I knew for certain I had locked it earlier. A gut feeling urged me to check it out, but panic began to creep in. Slowly, I approached the car, and that's when I saw something that froze me in place. On the back seat, there was an overturned chair, still warm, just like the one I'd seen in the library. My blood ran cold, and a wave of fear consumed me, making me want to run as far away as possible. With my heart racing, I took a deep breath, trying to steady the panic clawing at my chest. Without thinking twice, I opened the car door and jumped out, refusing to look back. The sound of the children's laughter seemed to follow me, echoing through the empty parking lot. I sprinted back toward the school entrance, my feet barely touching the ground, as the sensation of being watched grew stronger with each step. The lights continued to flicker unpredictably, and I could have sworn shadows danced on the walls, though my rational mind insisted I was alone. I finally reached the main doors and shoved them open with all my strength, escaping into the cold New Year's Eve night. The crisp air hit me like a slap, offering brief relief, but the unease clung to me. I glanced back at the school one last time, watching as the flickering lights dimmed and then went out completely. In the distance, people were already celebrating, but I couldn't bring myself to join them. My hands trembled as I walked toward my car, and just as I thought I was safe, one final giggle echoed faintly, sending chills down my spine. Still shaken, I decided to pull out my phone and call someone, anyone, to share what had just happened. But when I reached for it, I realized the battery was completely dead. Looking around, I noticed that somehow all my electronic devices had simultaneously stopped working. The sense of isolation intensified, and an unsettling dread settled over me. I slowed my pace, searching for a well-lit street where I might find help, or at least make sense of what was happening. As I walked through the now busier streets, the crowd around me celebrated the arrival of the new year with fireworks and laughter. But I felt utterly disconnected from the joy around me. Every shop window I passed seemed to reflect the image of that warm chair in the car, triggering an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. Then, one of the fireworks exploded unusually close, causing the ground to vibrate slightly. For a split second, I thought I saw a fleeting shadow move among the crowd. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there. My heart continued to race, and the nagging question of whether what I experienced was real or just a trick of my imagination haunted me as I tried to move forward on a night that should have been one of celebration. As I kept walking through the busy streets, I began to notice that something still felt off. The people around me seemed completely unaware of my presence, as if I were invisible to them. I tried to get someone's attention calling out, but no one responded. The sense of isolation deepened, and a growing unease made me feel more and more out of place. I decided to head toward a nearby park, hoping to find some quiet and clarity to figure out what was going on. When I reached the park, the atmosphere was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the bustling streets. The lights strung across the trees were all out, and the only sound was the distant crackling of fireworks in the background. I sat down on a bench, trying to calm my restless mind. That's when I noticed a shadow darting quickly between the trees. My heart raced, and a wave of dread washed over me. I stared intently in the direction of the movement, but nothing appeared. Then the sound of children's laughter returned, this time closer, echoing through the darkness of the park. A chill ran down my spine. I knew this wasn't just my imagination. Still sitting on the bench, I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was just the stress of grading and the loneliness of the night. But the giggling grew louder, surrounding me from every direction. I looked toward the trees, expecting to see kids playing, but there was no one there. The sensation of being watched became unbearable, and I started to sweat. I decided it was time to leave, but no matter which path I chose, I kept ending up back at the same bench. I stood up quickly, my steps feeling unsteady as if the ground beneath me was trembling slightly. The park lights remained off, and the darkness seemed to swallow every move I made. The giggling was deafening now, drowning out even the distant sound of fireworks. My heart pounded as I ran toward the park exit, refusing to look back. When I finally reached the entrance, one last giggle cut through the air, followed by an oppressive silence. I turned back for a final glance, but the park was empty and calm once more. Still shaken and unable to make sense of what had just happened, I continued walking home, carrying with me a lingering fear that I can't explain to this day.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I'll never forget the New Year's Eve when everything changed. I was working as a delivery driver that night, juggling deliveries with the holiday buzz. The streets were glowing with colorful lights, and the air had that crisp, electric feeling of anticipation. My shift started around 6 p.m. and I was expecting a calm night like so many others. But right after my first delivery, I noticed something odd. A black van parked a few yards away, watching my every move. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, maybe another driver passing through. But as I made more stops, the same van kept showing up. Always at a distance, never pulling up to deliver or pick up anything. My anxiety started to creep in when I realized it didn't matter how fast I moved. The van was always there. It was like someone was watching me, and the unease settled deep in my chest. I tried calling dispatch to report it, but the signal was weak, and the call dropped before I could explain what was going on. As the night went on, the feeling of being followed got worse. The black van stayed the same distance away, persistent, but never closing in. At one stop, I noticed it parked as soon as I arrived and stayed there, longer than seemed normal. My heart started pounding, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the growing tension in my gut told me otherwise. I decided to speed up, hoping to lose the van by driving faster. But every time I slowed down for a delivery, there it was again, pulling up closer than before. I found myself constantly checking the rearview mirror, tracking the van's every move. The streetlights reflected off its tinted windows, but I never saw anyone inside. The feeling of being a target became unavoidable, and real fear started to take hold. I kept wondering who was behind this and why, but the lack of answers only made it worse. As the night turned into early morning, the atmosphere grew heavier, the streets were emptier, and the darkness felt more oppressive. My last delivery took me to a quiet park, and I hoped the van wouldn't follow me all the way to the end of my shift, but as I turned to complete the drop-off, the van pulled up and parked directly in front of me, blocking my way out. My chest tightened, and a sense of helplessness overwhelmed me. I tried to stay calm, taking deep breaths, but my hands were visibly shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. That's when I knew I couldn't avoid it anymore. I had to face this. I called the police, explaining the situation and describing the van in as much detail as I could. While I waited for them to arrive, the van stayed put like it was daring me to make a move. Every second felt like an hour, and every little sound around me amplified my nerves. When I finally heard the distant sound of sirens, I felt a brief moment of relief, but just as quickly the van suddenly sped off, disappearing into the night as mysteriously as it had appeared. Even when the police arrived minutes later, I never got any answers about who was behind it or why it happened. To this day, that New Year's Eve still haunts me. While the police were investigating, my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every detail from that night was etched into my memory. The distant sound of fireworks, the glow of streetlights reflecting in the puddles, and that relentless black van. I tried to piece together what could possibly be going on, but nothing added up. Was it just some random stalking incident, or was something much darker at play? The lack of answers consumed me, and even after my shift ended, the feeling of vulnerability lingered. I knew I needed to talk to someone about what happened, but shame and fear held me back. Who would believe a story like this? I spent the next few days trying to return to my routine, but every time I saw a black van on the streets, my heart raced. I started avoiding late-night shifts and sticking to busier routes, but the paranoia never left. New Year's Eve was never the same for me again, and the unanswered questions about what really happened that night still haunt me, leaving me with more doubts than clarity. In the days that followed, I began to notice little things I had previously overlooked. I'd find myself delivering to neighborhoods I'd never been to before, and there was always this unsettling sense that someone was watching me from afar, even when the black van wasn't around. One night, as I returned home, I spotted a hooded figure standing under the dim glow of a streetlight, staring at my car for several minutes before disappearing into the darkness. The chill down my spine and the constant feeling of being watched left me drained, unable to truly relax, even during my downtime. I realized I had to take steps to feel safe again. I started installing cameras in my car and sharing my schedule with close friends, hoping someone would be willing to help if anything happened. Each new day was a mix of relief and dread, as I never knew when the black van might show up again. That New Year's Eve was burned into my memory as the beginning of a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Still, I tried to move forward, clinging to the hope that somehow all of it would stop haunting me. As the days passed, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It only grew stronger. One night, while delivering to an old, poorly lit building, I felt a presence behind me as soon as I stepped out of the car. When I quickly turned around, there it was, the black van, parked just a few yards away this time. My heart nearly stopped, and a wave of panic washed over me. I decided not to confront it directly and rushed toward the building's door, trying to ignore the overwhelming sense that I was being hunted. Once I reached the apartment, I slammed the door shut and locked it tightly, breathing heavily. Peering through the peephole, I saw the van still parked outside, its dark windows reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights. A deep sense of vulnerability took hold of me as I realized it wasn't just the van following me. It was someone or something determined to intimidate me in a much more direct way. I stayed locked in the apartment for what felt like an eternity, listening to every sound from the street, hoping the van would finally leave. But the night was far from over, and I knew that the real challenge was still ahead. I slammed the apartment door shut and locked it tightly, trying to steady my racing heart. I stood frozen, listening intently to every little noise from outside, hoping the van would finally drive away. But to my horror, I heard the sound of the van's metal scraping against the side of the building, as if someone was trying to force their way in. My instincts screamed at me to retreat further inside, barricading myself even more. It was a nightmare. I felt paralyzed with fear and adrenaline, not knowing what to expect next. I tried calling the police again, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The minutes dragged on like hours as I waited. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed down the building's stairwell, each one pounding in my ears like a drumbeat of dread. My entire body was tense, every nerve on edge. Then, a sharp, metallic sound made me jump. It was coming from outside, like something was hitting my car. I ran to the window, and with a mix of fear and disbelief, saw the black van parked again, this time with its headlights on, casting an eerie glow directly onto my car. There was no sign of anyone inside, but its unrelenting presence left no doubt in my mind. This was no coincidence. The overwhelming feeling of being hunted hit me full force, and I realized that this New Year's Eve nightmare was far from over. In that moment, I felt a mix of desperation and resolve. I couldn't just stay locked in the apartment waiting for something or someone to come for me. Still clutching the phone, I tried calling the police again, but the call dropped once more, leaving me feeling even more isolated. I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the rising panic, and decided to make a run for it through the back door of the apartment. I hoped I could slip away unnoticed and escape the van that seemed determined to corner me. Every step I took was filled with dread, but the urge to free myself from that suffocating situation pushed me forward. When I reached the sidewalk, the black van was still there, parked just a few yards away, its headlights blazing intensely. My heart pounded as I frantically searched for a way out, but the streets were nearly deserted, lit only by the faint reflections of Christmas lights. Suddenly, the van's headlights shut off, plunging the scene into total darkness. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what was coming next. Then, without warning, the van roared to life and sped off into the night, vanishing as mysteriously as it had appeared. Even now, I can't make sense of what really happened that New Year's Eve, but I remember every detail of that night as one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The unanswered questions and the chilling memory of the black van still haunt me, leaving me with a lingering fear I can't shake.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.